Hi, my name is Marie Romagnano, founder of Healthcare Professionals for Divine Mercy. I'm so happy to present to you our educational conferences that integrate medicine, bioethics, and the spirituality of divine mercy in patient care for healthcare professionals. Because of their importance, even if you're not a medical professional, we invite you to join us. Today, I wish to summarize a conference presentation by His Excellency Robert McMannus, Bishop of the Diocese of Worcester, Massachusetts, and a member of the American Bishops Subcommittee on Healthcare, who in his talk titled Catholic and Religious Directives outlines for us the Catholic teaching in regards to beginning and end-of-life issues. The Holy Scripture gives witness to Jesus' concern for the sick and dying. He healed a leopard, brought back a young girl to life, and healed the hemorrhaging of an elderly woman. Thus, the Catholic Church has always considered the fundamental importance of its healing ministry as rooted in Jesus' ministry. Initially, this was done by religious brothers and sisters, but is now done primarily by laity. One cannot be called a Catholic institution unless approved by the local bishop, and this designation may be removed if it does not follow the Church's teachings. With regards to life, a most fundamental concept is that we are created in the image of God, the body is created by the marital act, and the soul by God. The soul is immortal and not destroyed by death. Bishop McMannus discusses ethical relativism and noted that there are certainly acts that are intrinsically evil. He reviews three forms of relativism: pragmatic relativism. If it works and is successful, we should do it. Consequential relativism. The end justifies the means. Motivism. Whether it is right or wrong depends on how the person feels about it. The Church teaches objective moral truth. Regarding the beginning of life issues, one must recognize the sanctity of human life and that what is technologically feasible is not always morally right. The marital act is both unitive and procreative and must not be separated. In vitro fertilization and surrogate motherhood separate these two parts. Another area that he discusses is direct and indirect abortion. The former is never permitted, as the procedure and intent is to kill the child. Examples of an indirect abortion include a miscarriage and ectopic pregnancy. The ectopic pregnancy will cause the mother's death if untreated. If treated, the primary intent is to save the mother's life by excision of the fallopian tube. The side effect of the embryo's death is foreseen, but not the primary reason for the procedure, and that is morally acceptable. Bishop discusses end-of-life issues, particularly definitions of ordinary and extraordinary care, and proportionate and disproportionate care as it relates to food and hydration. He closes with a quote from St. John Paul II when speaking to healthcare professionals in the Jubilee year. "Cure if possible, comfort always." Let us listen to Bishop McMannus as he speaks on this very important topic for today's family, caring for the most vulnerable among us. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. Good morning, everybody. I suppose I should apologize at the beginning because I do not have a PowerPoint presentation. And that's the state of the art now, but I'm of the old school. And so I'm just going to, a few random thoughts for all of you. Well, the first thing I want to do is to set a theological context or a church context for healthcare professionals like yourself and the ministry that you carry out in the name of the church. The first is that if we look at sacred scripture, it is very, very clear that the miracles of Jesus are indications of his concern for the sick and suffering of his own time. He cleansed lepers, he restored speech to the mute man, he cured a woman of chronic hemorrhaging, he brought a young girl back to life, and he cured, as you remember, Simon Peter's mother of a desperate fever. So his public ministry, the public ministry of Christ, integral to that ministry was healing. And as Catholics, obviously, we believe that the salvific mission of Christ has been confided to the church that he founded and and built it on the rock of Peter's faith. And so the salvific mission of Christ lives on in history through the ministry of the church, and an integral part of the church's ministry for centuries has been the healing ministry. So we have to realize that in our Catholic healthcare systems today, what we do as healthcare professionals is rooted in the ministry of Jesus within the community of the church today. Historically, it was religious women and men, sisters and brothers, and sometimes orders of priests, that their charism was to heal the sick. And they institutionalized this charism of healing in their own order and in establishing what we know today as hospitals and places of care. And also within the history of the church, it has become the responsibility now, especially with the diminution of the number of men and women religious, specifically those who are doing healthcare, many of the orders who did have hospitals or healthcare facilities, they've passed that on to lay people. And I'll say a brief, if I have time at the end of my presentation, I'll talk what is being called juridic persons that now sort of have assumed the charism that was originally exercised by religious men and women. So now, fundamentally, Catholic healthcare ministry is fundamentally a lay type of ministry. And also it has become incumbent upon the bishops to take a very active role in the oversight of healthcare ministry. No institution, according to church law, no institution in any diocese can assume the title Catholic. That an institution can call itself Catholic only when it has the permission of the local bishop. So when a new institution is set up in a diocese, they must petition the bishop to grant them the title of Catholic. And if things happen in the life of an institution which comes to the bishop's attention, that he also has the right, if the situation is not corrected, to remove the title of Catholic. Here at in the Diocese of Worcester, we have one Catholic hospital, St. Vincent's, here in the city. But it's an interesting type of phenomenon because it was begun by the Sisters of Providence from out in the Diocese of Springfield. And for years they ran that hospital. But they also had the support of the diocese. However, at one point, the sisters sold the hospital to for-profit institutions. And it's sort of, they've been sold and resold and sold again. So right now, St. Vincent's is atypical in terms of Catholic healthcare institutions because it's a for-profit reality. But the hospital is run like a Catholic hospital, and we have a covenant agreement between the Diocese of Worcester and the hospital. And if it comes to my attention, thanks be to God, it hasn't. I've been 14 years in the Diocese of Worcester this month. But if something were being done in the hospital that contravened Church's moral teaching, specifically Catholic biomedical ethics, that I would notify the hospital, and they would have 30 days to respond to my notification to correct the situation that has been judged immoral. If they do not change it, that I would withdraw the Catholic title from the hospital, and they would no longer be representing the church in any way. So the bishop, and especially as these, and I'll say it a little bit at the end, as I mentioned, as Catholic institutions, Catholic medical institutions are partnering with non-Catholic institutions, they become those mergers and those partnerships become very complicated morally. And the bishop has to be very attentive to make sure that even if the partnership is deemed morally justifiable at its beginning, the bishop has to be attentive because sometimes these agreements are not lived out as they're supposed to be. So the point is, the present Catholic healthcare professionals work within a church context and are carrying out the work of the church and the work of Jesus. What I'd like to say, that's point number one. Point number two is to point out to you some of the theological and moral principles that are interwoven throughout the ethical and religious directives. These directives that now are operative in the Church of the United States, this booklet is in its 5th edition, And as a matter of fact, I'm in the process, for the last 19 years, as long as I've been a bishop, I have been on the doctrine committee of the USCCB, the National Bishops' Conference. For the last 4 years, and I'm also the chair of the subcommittee on healthcare issues, for the last 4 years, we have been revising Section 6 of this document, which has to do with mergers of Catholic and non-Catholic institutions. It's taken that long, consultation with professionals, care institutions, with the Holy See, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. So finally, my subcommittee is submitting to the body of bishops in June. We have a meeting in Florida for approval of that revision. So there are 6 parts to this particular document. The ERDs, we'll call them just for brevity's sake. But I'm only going to look at sections 4 and 5. Section 4 is care for innocent life at the beginning of its gestation, and also look at end-of-life issues. So those are basically the 2 areas of my reflection. So what I'd like to do for the rest of this presentation is to point out to you some fundamental theological and moral theological positions. So first of all, that the most fundamental theological insight in terms of Catholic medical profession is that the human person, created in the image and likeness of God, is a being that is once corporal and spiritual. And the unity of the body, the soul and body relationship, is so profound that one has to consider the soul to be the very form, the vivifying principle of the body. And we must remember also, according to Catholic doctrine, that although the act of creation is a partnership between God and the human married couple, that the soul is not produced, obviously, by the marital act of the couple. The soul is created by God, and at the moment of fertilization, that soul is individually embodies and souls the developing body of the child, which will vivify the whole human enterprise from birth, from conception to natural death. So it was very interesting. If you followed, Pope Francis supposedly did have a conversation with an Italian atheist named Scalfari, and according to Scalfari, the Pope said that there is no hell because souls that have done evil just disappear. Well, obviously the Pope would not say that, because the immortality of the soul is a fundamental dogmatic truth of the Catholic faith. So the soul perdures through death, and then, as we celebrate today in the Ascension, that Christ has taken our humanity into the life of the Trinity, and that at the moment of final judgment, our souls and our bodies, which have decayed, will, for those who are saved, will be united, and we will enjoy the glorified life in heaven that Christ and our Blessed Mother does at the present time. So those are some fundamental theological principles. However, the Church's ministry of healing the sick, curing the ill, is carried on at any particular moment in history within a particular context. And one of the great challenges to Catholic healthcare ministry nowadays is the ethical climate in which we find ourselves. And fundamentally, the ethical climate in Western culture, and specifically in the United States, is what is called ethical relativism. If you remember that Pope Benedict XVI, I think it was the homily right before he was elected successor of St. Peter and Bishop of Rome, he talked about a dictatorship of relativism. And if you talk to people, if you talk to Mr. and Mrs. American Catholic, they are fundamentally ethical relativists, which creates a huge pastoral problem for the Church, because in our moral theology, we teach certain things that are called, that we teach objective moral truth. And that is sort of enshrined in that we state very clearly that there are certain human acts that are intrinsically evil, which means to say the act is so vitiated in its content that it breaks our relationship with God and sort of detours us on our pilgrimage home to our Father's house in heaven. And an act that is immoral and illicit, the intention of the actor and the circumstances within which the actor performs the human act, intention and circumstances cannot turn an immoral act into a good act. But in the type of ethical relativism that we face here in the United States and in Western culture are the following. One instance is pragmatism, which says if it works and is successful, it should be done. The second type of form of ethical relativism is consequentialism. The end justifies the means. A third type of ethical relativism is emotivism, which is to say right or wrong is determined by how deeply I feel it. That if I'm very worked up about something, that the correctness of the moral argument is determined by how passionately I argue the case. And you hear that all the time. As a matter of fact, in a society that's becoming more and more, what is the word I'm searching for, is more and more crude in its discourse, the level of emotivism has reached a crescendo pitch. So it's in that type of moral relativistic culture that the church is trying to carry out its mission to cure and to heal. So let's go right now to part 4 of the ERDs, which is entitled Issues in Care for the Beginning of Life. And again, this particular section, are any of you familiar with these ERDs? They're very, very important. And the form is that each section has an introductory narrative. And then that narrative is followed by a set of new directives, which sort of implement in a very pithy way what the narrative is talking about. So in section 4, which has to do with issues at the beginning of life, the following principles, moral principles, are repeated in the directives. First is the sanctity of human life at its beginning, the dignity of marriage in the Marriage Act by which human life is transmitted. And another very important insight in this, the section on the beginnings of human life is what is technologically possible is not always morally right. In the literature, it's sometimes called the technological imperative. If it can be done technologically, it should be done. Making the decision using technologies at the beginning of life is very complex, and it takes a lot of serious moral reflection to decide whether this technology should be used or this technology should not be used. So first of all, one of the biggest technological interventions at the beginning of life, as I'm sure you know, is in vitro fertilization. Very, very common, very, very expensive. And our Catholic hospitals often are under tremendous pressure to carry out that technology. But unfortunately, in vitro fertilization is an intrinsically immoral act. Why? Because the Marriage Act, according to the Church, our moral reflection, is that the Marriage Act has two related meanings. It has the unitive meaning, which is the sharing of the life and love between the married woman and the married man. That's the unitive dimension of the marital act. And the second dimension of the marital act is the procreative, which this act engenders the gift of human life. Those two meanings cannot be deliberately separated. And if they are deliberately separated, through example, artificial means of contraception, it vitiates the moral act, and it becomes an immoral act. Now, obviously, in vitro fertilization, that technology sort of usurps the integrity of the marital act, and it can do so in at least two ways. And the ethical directives talk about heterologous artificial fertilization, which is a reproductive technology that involves using the gametes for one or more donors. And that is prohibited because the act of conception, the act of fertilization, is brought about outside of the body of the people who want to have a baby. And not only is it outside of the body, but the very gametes, the sperm and the ovum that are used to bring about new life, come from different people, and not the mother and father of the child. So heterologous in vitro fertilization is wrong because it undercuts the unity of the Marriage Act. And also, there is another type of in vitro fertilization, which is called homologous artificial procreation. And this gamete this technology uses at least one of the gametes of the couple. So for example, it's either the ovum comes from the woman or the sperm comes from the man who are in this relationship, but one of the other gametes comes from a donor. So again, the integrity of the Marriage Act is undercut because of one of the gametes coming from someone outside of the love relationship. We are celebrating in this July 2018, it's the 50th anniversary of Pope Paul VI's prophetic document, Humanae Vitae, on the regulation of birth. If you remember, in 1968, when that document was produced and promulgated, a firestorm broke out in the Catholic Church. And it was especially intense here in the United States. Actually, some bishop conferences made public statements that sort of soft-pedaled the document. The American bishops made a good statement months after the document, Humanae Vitae, but if you read that document, it is in fact prophetic. And Pope Paul VI said, when the unitive and procreative acts are deliberately separated, either before, during, or after the Marriage Act, if that happens, that a flood of other types of immorality would come upon us. And that if you look at the state of in Western culture, the state of sexual marital realities, that the document proved prophetic. That it has led to in matter of fact, this Me Too movement that's going on among women who are coming forward to tell their horrific stories about being sexually abused by powerful men, that I would dare say that this type of disrespect for women by men who feel that they have the sexual prowess to do what they want to do, that's definitely, in my mind, and I'm not the only one saying this, but I could see the relationship when people can express their sexuality without respect for a loving reunion between a man and a woman, then the repercussions of the use of sexuality is very, very dangerous. And we're living with this aftermath. Just among our young people, this hookup culture, it is astounding. On college campuses, it's just astounding the number of casual hookup relationships that happen on a college campus, even, sad to say, on our Catholic college campuses. So in vitro fertilization, which is very common and is, matter of fact, in our Catholic institutions, for example, the Diocese of Worcester, when Obamacare was promulgated, we spent thousands of dollars with legal fees in making sure that we could have insurance policies for our lay people that did not cover these types of medical technologies that are deemed by the church as immoral. Another technology that is immoral is surrogate motherhood. When a woman, the child is conceived, fertilized in vitro, and the fertilized ovum is placed in the womb of someone who has come forward to bring the ovum to gestation. Again, that is, although there's two moral evils involved there. One, it's in vitro fertilization, that's how the child is conceived, and then it is breaking the unitive dimension of the marriage acts that either go before or follow the birth of the child. So surrogate motherhood is prohibited. Now, there's another distinction that we have to make in terms of caring for life at its vulnerable beginnings, and that is the distinction between a direct abortion and an indirect abortion. So let me read very quickly Directive 47, which very succinctly and very accurately describes the nature of a direct abortion. Directive 47, let me see here, yes. Directive 45 first. Abortion, that is, the directly intended termination of pregnancy before viability or the directly intended destruction of a viable fetus is never permitted. Every procedure whose sole immediate effect is the termination of pregnancy before viability is an abortion, which in its moral context includes the interval between conception and implantation of the embryo. Health care institutions are not to provide abortion services, even based on the principle of material cooperation, which is a whole nother lecture. In this context, Catholic healthcare institutions need to be concerned about the danger of scandal in any association with abortion providers. There was a cause célèbre out in a Catholic hospital in Phoenix, Arizona, where, run by at least the CEO was a religious sister of mercy, where an abortion was performed. A woman had a very serious health condition, and the ethics committee of that Catholic hospital made the faulty decision that it was not a direct abortion. And actually, it came to the attention of the bishop, Bishop Thomas Olmsted, who was a fine bishop, and he said no. His moral evaluation of the procedure was that it was a directed abortion. And the Religious Sisters of Mercy was actually excommunicated, because for someone to participate in a direct abortion, even performing it or giving consent for it, knowing that it's wrong, is excommunicated. Well, obviously, the sister was eventually reunited with the church. But this is how seriously the church takes the act of direct abortion. But there are also instances of indirect abortion, the most common of which is a miscarriage. That's in a real moral sense, a miscarriage is an indirect abortion. But there's also the classical exception or indication of an indirect abortion was in the ectopic pregnancy, when the fertilized ovum does not attach itself to the uterine wall, but on the fallopian tube. And that can be that reality can be a death dealing for the mother. So, according to the church teaching, it's the principle of double effect, that the intention of the medical procedure is not to kill the child, e.g. an abortion, but the intention of the medical procedure is to save the mother's life by excising the part of the fallopian tube that has the fertilized ovum. That is an indirect abortion, because the intention is to save the life of the mother. That's the primary intention. The side effect, which is foreseen, we know that the child will die when the fallopian tube is operated upon. But that was not the direct intention. It's a foreseen side effect. So what in fact is, in one sense, an abortion is an indirect abortion and can be morally justified if the principles are properly applied. Is everybody clear about the distinction between a direct abortion, which is always in every war, it's an intrinsically immoral act, and an indirect abortion that in some circumstances can be justified? Let's see. All right. So why don't we move on to, let me just conclude by this conclusion to my reflections on Part 4 of the directives. Certain directives in this Part 4 of the document addresses other techniques and technologies that are related to a Catholic institution's commitment to the protection and preservation of innocent human life. The provision of genetic and infertility counseling, which is a great contribution that Catholic healthcare institution and Catholic healthcare professionals can provide to couples who are suffering from infertility. The promotion of adoption, in a sense that we here in Massachusetts, that when same-sex marriage was legalized according to judicial fiat here in the Commonwealth, that one of the fallouts was our adoption agencies. That the Archdiocese of Boston actually surrendered its license because it was going to be forced legally to place adoptive children in a same-sex marriage. So the Archdiocese withdrew they just gave up doing adoptions. Here in the Diocese of Worcester, I decided, no, we're not going to give up our license to carry out adoptions, but also we will only do it according to the teaching of the church. We would not refer adopted children to same-sex couple. Guess what happened? They stopped sending children to us. So we were forced out of the adoption service because of this immoral activity that's going on. So, however, adoption is counseling couples about adoption. I think is a great service that Catholic healthcare ministry can carry out. So those are just some reflections on the care of life at its vulnerable beginnings. Now let's go to section 5 of the healthcare, the ERDs that deal with death and dying. So let me just list for you some fundamental moral, ethical principles that underpin the Church's teaching on death and dying. The Church, in her moral teaching on the end-of-life issues, witnesses to this fact, to the belief that God has created each person for eternal life, that God has given life, and ultimately, in a theological context, only God can take life from us in His time and in His way. Another very interesting principle also is this. Although recognizing the omnipotence of God and the sovereignty of God over human life, the duty to preserve life is not an absolute duty. That's interesting. I think there's a question here that raised that. What does that mean? It means that under certain circumstances, we can surrender our life for the ultimate good, which is God Himself. And that, for example, martyrdom. Martyrdom is actually a free giving of one's own life to witness to ultimate truth. Pope Francis, just a couple of months ago, established another criterion for beatification and canonization, is that when someone, not in a sense of martyrdom in an act of aggression by a persecutor, but if someone gives his or her life in a type of devoted, lifelong service to someone else, that can be a criterion for sanctity and for canonization. So while life is a fundamental good, it's not an absolute good. And the task of medicine, as you all know as professionals, is to care even when it cannot cure. The use of life-sustaining technology must be judged in light of the Christian meaning of life, suffering, and death. In this way, two extremes are to be avoided when we're dealing with issues of death and dying. The first is we must talk about the classical distinction in Catholic moral theology, the difference between ordinary and extraordinary means of medical treatment. Sometimes in the literature it's called proportionate or disproportionate means of medical treatment. And in a nutshell, it's this, that a medical technology intervening at the end of life is deemed morally ordinary if the benefit that technology will provide the dying patient, the sick patient, if that technology causes more benefit than burden, it is an ordinary means of medical treatment and must be used. Having said that, however, there's also the reality of disproportionate and extraordinary means of medical treatment, which is to say, if technological intervention causes more burden than benefit, then A, and it's judged so on sound moral grounds, A, that extraordinary intervention does not have to be used. And if in fact, if that technology has been used and it is then later deemed extraordinary, it can be removed. And that has become very, very controversial in the Catholic Church in the last 25 years or so, 30 years, especially to do with artificial means of nutrition and hydration. However, right before he died in 2004, and I'll find that eventually, that John Paul II intervened, and in March 20th, 2004, he made the following intervention, a moral judgment on whether artificial means of nutrition and hydration are ordinary or extraordinary. It is a very, very well done point of view. This is what the Holy Father said. I should like particularly to underline how the administration of food and water, even when provided by artificial means, always represents a natural means of preserving life, not a medical act. You remember that the distinction between ordinary and extraordinary means of medical treatment, that reflection focuses on a particular medical act, a particular medical technology. The Holy Father goes on, its use, furthermore, should be considered in principle, which is key, ordinary and proportionate, and as such morally obligatory insofar and until it is seen to have attained its proper finality, which in the present case consists in providing nourishment to the patient and alleviation of his suffering. That is a very dense but very brilliant summation of moral evaluation of nutrition, artificial nutrition, hydration. And the key is, the Holy Father is saying right up front that it is an ordinary means of treatment, in principle. And that simply means that's a flag to be aware that although in the ordinary cases it's to be used, there could be some instances when artificial means of nutrition and hydration could be removed, because that, as the Holy Father, the finality of the act, which is to give people nourishment and to avoid suffering, if that intervention is not doing either of those, bring about those finalities, then the intervention can be described morally as extraordinary. And this is how we bishops have institutionalized that teaching in our directives in section 5, which is, it's number 58. This is what we bishops have said. In principle, we start off with that. In principle, there is an obligation to provide patients with food and water, including medically assisted nutrition and hydration for those who cannot take food orally. This obligation extends to patients in chronic and presumably irreversible conditions, e.g. the persistent vegetative state, who can reasonably be expected to live indefinitely if such care is given. Medically assisted nutrition and hydration become morally optional when they cannot reasonably be expected to prolong life, or when they would be excessively burdensome for the patient or would cause significant physical discomfort, for example, resulting from complications in the means employed. For instance, as a patient draws close to inevitable death from an underlying progressive and fatal condition, certain measures to provide nutrition and hydration may become excessively burdensome and therefore not obligatory, in light of their very limited ability to prolong life or to provide comfort. It's a very complex situation. What I say to my priest is, when someone comes to the rectory looking for moral guidance on these types of very complex situations, I say to the priest, call me first, because it can be very complex. And what is absolutely key is that in a death and dying issues vis-a-vis Catholic moral theology, what is crucial is that the quality or the correctness of the moral judgment, whether something is extraordinary or ordinary, the correctness of that moral judgment is rooted in the best medical knowledge. And that is why an attendant issue for death and dying in the Catholic context are durable powers of attorney. That for years the Church has said that a durable power of attorney is the most morally acceptable type of substituted judgment, because the person who has this power of attorney, obviously the first consideration is that the patient is no longer medically and psychologically able to make reasonable decisions about his or her health care. When that state is reached, the person who has the power of attorney is able to speak to the physicians, to the nurses, to the professionals, and have an accurate account of what is this person dying. Has the moment of fatality arrived? And within that context, you make a best moral decision. If you have a living will that you make when you're 55 years old, and you don't want this, you don't want that, you don't want the following, then it opens the floodgates of very misinformed decisions at the end of life. And what has happened in some cases, when the living will is given to the medical professional, that he or she, in a sense, becomes the arbiter of what is going to happen to that person. And it's a very, very difficult and perplexing situation. So I'm going to conclude this by just reading, and if there are any questions, you can ask them during the question and answer situation. That I want to conclude with words that the Holy Father issued to medical professionals during the Great Jubilee year. And this is the words that I make my own. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, I exhort you as men and women of science, responsible for the dignity of the medical profession, to guard jealously the principle according to which the true task of medicine is to cure if possible, always to care. As a pledge in support of this, your authentic humanitarian mission to give comfort and support to your suffering brothers and sisters, I remind you of the words of Jesus. Amen, I say to you, whatever you did to one of these, least my brothers and sisters, you did to me. Thank you very much.